So everyone is on mute, so we want to hear you when you talk. If you have anything to say or have a question, just type it into the chat window. The three of us will monitor it and will answer your questions by voice or the chat. Good, a quick sound check. If you hear us well, please put a thumb up into the chat. Yes, great. Thank you so much. Good. Franz, say something too, please.
Yeah, it works. Hello.
Good. That's great. Margot?
Hi there.
Good. Excellent. Good. We have 1 minute to go. At 4 p.m. sharp, we start. Oh, it's already 4. And quite a few people are missing, so let's give them 30 seconds more to log in. Good. I think that the 30 seconds are over. More people have joined. So thanks everyone for joining this webinar. The webinar is co-hosted by COVID AWS. And we have launched this session to give you an update on what is happening in the compliance space. We do work with quite a number of financial customers in Switzerland. And we hear often from these financial customers that there are some concerns and with the Finma regulations, what they need to consider. And as we hear that so often, we have decided to launch this webinar, and quite a few people have registered. So thanks everyone for taking the time to spend 45 minutes with us. And I think we can kick off now, so more and more people join. So thanks again for being with us. So the title of the webinar is AWS under the Finma spotlight, cloud compliance in the Swiss finance sector. And so we have launched that together with AWS, and we do have Franz and Margot here from AWS, and they will present the majority of the topics because both of them are really close to all these requirements, and also the Finma report, and can give you real hands-on experience with going through such a process and what you need to look at. So for those of you that don't know COVID, I have prepared a small introduction slide, but before I go there, I give you the agenda. So first is a very small welcome from my side. So my name is Marco Kündig, and then we will have a quick introduction from Franz. Franz is a partner architect at AWS, and then Marco will take over to present you what is really relevant in the compliance space in the financial area. So for those of you that don't know COVID, I have made a small introduction slide. I wanted to give you a very brief introduction, probably 30 seconds of what COVID is and what COVID does. So COVID is really a born in the cloud company. We have been founded probably 5 years ago, and we really focus on all relevant cloud technologies. So our main partner is AWS, so we do a lot of AWS projects. We are an advanced consulting partner, where there are only very few here in Switzerland. We do a lot of containers and Kubernetes projects, so many companies come to us and ask us to run containers on AWS or containers on-prem, and we help them doing that. We obviously also help in automation. There, our main partner is Puppet, and of course, all these new projects, they do have a transformation aspect in it. Most of them do agile work with it, Scrum and Safe and so forth, and we also have agile coaches that can help you doing these cloud projects also in an agile way. As I don't talk much during this session, I won't go to the full introduction of myself, but you can read it on the right-hand side. And I'm also a co-founder at CodeBit. So we are 13 people. We are based in Zurich and St. Gallen, and we are really close to AWS and do a lot of projects with them. So with that, I can already hand over to Franz, and Franz will give you a brief introduction on what AWS is, what regions they have, and all of these things. Franz, please take over. I will end my sharing, and you can take over from here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
It's loading. Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So my name is Franz Bayerl. I'm a partner solution architect at Amazon Web Services, and I'm working mainly with partners in Switzerland. And why are we here today? We want to talk about Finma compliance. And before we do that, I want to give you a short introduction into the AWS infrastructure and talk about how the setup is and how you can achieve security on the AWS infrastructure. So what we see currently is there's a large adoption going on of companies going to the AWS cloud. In August 2020, we saw 400,000 individuals being certified on AWS, and this number was growing within 1 year on 85%. So lots and lots of AWS adoption is happening right now, and especially with the region that is coming to Zurich in Switzerland in 2020, this will be a big topic also in Switzerland. I'm sure a lot of you already know about AWS, so I won't go that much into detail into the introduction. So I'm just going to show you the infrastructure that we have and a little bit of history on it. So in the first 5 years of AWS, like a decade ago, there were only 4 regions, 2 in North America, 1 in Europe, 1 in Asia. And as you can see on the second slide, 5 years later, there were 7 more regions around the world. And today we have 24 regions that are composed of 77 availability zones. And there are 5 more regions planned. One of the regions that is planned is the Zurich region. We've had presence in Switzerland since 2016 and opened our first offices there. In 2017, we opened some points of presence, which is like technical connections to the AWS backbone, like CloudFront endpoints or Direct Connect endpoints, so you can hook into the AWS network. We opened edge locations in 2018. And as I said before, the Zurich region is starting in the second half of 2022. And it will be composed of 3 availability zones. Each availability zone is basically its own building. So the region has built-in redundancy and high reliability. So if one building isn't able to power up, for example, if there's a power outage, the other 2 availability zones will take over the workloads. On this slide, you can see the Amazon network. So Amazon provides its own network connection between the regions. There are lots of oceanic undersea cables going from region to region. And this is really a very strong backend that you can leverage if you go to the AWS cloud. Companies can directly connect to it using Direct Connect and hook into this network. As you can imagine, this growing network consumes a lot of power. So this is a topic that Amazon is very concerned with. So in 2019, we co-founded the Climate Pledge, which is an initiative that aims to lower the carbon footprint of the whole infrastructure. So the goal is to be net zero carbon by 2040. And a short-term goal is that renewable energy is used. So 100% renewable energy should be used by 2025. And we already have 3 regions that are carbon neutral, 1 in US and 2 in Europe. And also Amazon as a company, the delivery is also going to be zero carbon by 2030. Amazon invests a lot into renewable energy projects. So there are currently 127 projects going on. You can imagine like wind parks and solar parks, and they generate as much power as 1.7 million US homes would use. Also, running workloads in AWS is very energy efficient. So research showed that it's 3.6 times more energy efficient than running the same workload in an average data center. And this is because of the economies of scale. And in AWS, in the cloud, you can utilize the resources much better. Okay, so I've talked about the infrastructure that is underlying, and the topic today is security. So how can you run secure workloads on this infrastructure? And one basic principle of this is the shared responsibility model. So AWS takes care of the underlying infrastructure, and the customer is responsible for basically getting the configuration right. So if you use AWS services, there are different layers of abstractions in AWS services. You can use very low abstraction layer like Elastic Compute Cloud instances, which are basically just virtual machines you spawn up. And you have to provide those with an operating system. But as a customer, if you start your own machines, you're responsible for doing security patches, configuring the networks and the firewalls and so forth. If you use higher level services like DynamoDB, a lot of this is managed for you by AWS. And this gives you more, this gives you more, this takes away a lot of heavy lifting for you, because AWS is managing the service for you, and you're not responsible for all the security in the service. So what you can do is, when you talk about security, one thing is the region that launched in Switzerland. So if you use the Switzerland region, your data is located in Switzerland, and Marco will talk a bit more about the implications of this. And the other thing is, if you use the cloud, you can choose the degree of responsibility you want to shift over to AWS. So if you use low-level services like EC2, you're managing a lot of this yourself, so you have the responsibility. And if you use higher-level services like EKS, ECS, DynamoDB, AWS is managing a lot of the security for you. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Margot.
Thank you, Franz. I think you have to stop sharing and then I can take over. So, Marco, do you want to just confirm? Can you see the main slide?
Yes, it's fine. We see it.
Great stuff. Okay, yeah, so thank you. My name is Margot. I'm a security solutions architect for AWS. I have been with AWS for 4.5 years. I'm based in the Zurich office. I do actually work for the EMEA team now, specializing in security and compliance. And I want to talk to you today about Finma. I have had numerous Finma conversations with customers over the last 4.5 years, and indeed with Finma themselves. And the goal of my session today, I've put it together and taken it from the approach of, if I was working for you, if I was the customer, what are the tools that I can use from AWS that will enable me to have constructive and successful conversations with the regulator? So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about Finma, whom I'm sure need no introduction, but just for context, they're the Swiss regulator for financial institutions, and they supervise not only first-tier banks and insurance organizations, but essentially all financial intermediaries here in Switzerland, or all financial intermediaries dealing with Swiss CID data. So also, for example, traders, security dealers, stock exchanges, and small fintech startups. Typically, when we have Finma conversations, they're typically around these 5 circlers. These 5 circulars are very readable, which is an important thing to say. Many laws and attestations are not readable at all. I'm looking at you, GDPR, but these are very, very clear. They're quite short documents. They're printed in German, French, Italian, and English. And when I'm talking to my own colleagues, my own teammates, but also when I'm talking to customers, I highly encourage them to go in and find the Finma margin requirement control that is supporting the risk or creating the risk that we're discussing at that point in time. So these are typically the 5 Finma circulars that we speak about. Now, being an AWS employee, there's definitely one unusual thing about it that I've come across for the first time really in my career, and that is that we can be very, very quiet when we make announcements about things. I've still, 4.5 years in, I'm still yet to work out the reasons for this. But as Franz mentioned there, you know, we announced the launch of the region last year, and there was definitely some fanfare about that. That was, I think, in Q3 of last year that was announced. But in December of last year, December 2020, announced on our security blog post was the launch of our ISAE 3000 Type 2 attestation report for Finma. And this really it essentially moves the needle for our customers when it comes to having those Finma conversations with the regulator. And is really a very important announcement. And that's what I want to focus part of my session on today with you, how to use this in those conversations with Finma. So let's look at this report. The first thing to be aware of is you access it via AWS Artifacts, just like you would do C5, SOC, or PCI, any of the rest of our reports attestations. Then it has scope, and this actually applies to all reports, attestations, and laws. So this particular ISAE 3000 Type 2 attestation was executed with an auditor, and they're Ernst & Young in Zurich. That means they're applicable to Swiss law. That's important, right? It's not an auditor that's in Seattle beside one of our head offices. It's not in Luxembourg where the SARL is. It's here in Switzerland, a Swiss auditor. Then the report applies to 22 regions. This is also very important. It means you don't need to wait for the Swiss region to start using this report in your conversation with Finma. It also means that when we do go live with the region, maybe you're looking at disaster recovery solutions and you're looking at having parts of your workload in Zurich and parts of your workload in Frankfurt. So it's still very important that all the other regions are in scope as well. So 22 regions are in scope, and then there's also a series of edge locations and local zones as well. And then 124 services are in scope of the report. Again, this is important. Those of you that know us well know that we've actually more than 200 services. This means when you're going into a conversation with the regulator using this report as one of your key tools, you need to ensure that you have put guardrails in place to prevent your developing teams from perhaps using the other services which are not yet in scope. So I really highly encourage you with your solution architect and with partners like Copebit to look at using services like AWS organizations and service control policies to enable that. This protects your development teams as they innovate and are spinning up different services, that they don't inadvertently deploy something that you have agreed with the regulator you will not do based on this report. And the report is time-bound. This is, again, very important. It applies to lots of reports like SOC and C5. This means that over this period of time, the 1st of April 2020 to the 30th of September 2020, these services, these 124 services, were tested against a series of controls that I'm going to show later on in 22 regions. This is particularly important if you have to demonstrate something to a regulator based on a time period. If you wish more services to be included in scope or different time cycles, this is something you can communicate directly to AWS via your account team or via partner, via Copebit, for example. Now, when this was announced, I have a link there to a blog post, and you'll see in the blog post introduction text like this. And this is breaking all the rules of PowerPoint, putting up a blurb of text like this. Essentially, it's in the introduction. You can read it later yourselves. And essentially, it's saying we provide the evidence that the AWS control environment has the evidence requested by Finma against the Finma control margins. But the reason that I've put this here is not because I want you to read the blurb of text, but I want to draw your eye to this term controls. We're talking about AWS control environment, we're talking about complementary user entity controls, and we're talking about Finma control objectives. And that's quite interesting. It really brings a focus and a light on the importance of understanding what a control actually is. Sometimes when I'm speaking with customers, they have a tendency to say to me things like, is AWS Finma compliant? Punct, full stop. It's an incredibly difficult question to answer because it doesn't actually make sense, because it's the coming together of all of these controls that actually brings about a conversation where you can start talking about compliancy with the regulator. And so we have Finma controls, complementary user entity controls, which is on the customer side, bringing us back to what Franz presented earlier around the shared responsibility model, and then the AWS control environment. Of course, I know when a customer is asking me that, I know what they're asking is the AWS control environment secure and are the regulator okay with it? That's actually what they're asking. But this is why it's very important to understand what is meant by the term controls. And so I know for myself at that point, I started to look at the relationship of controls to risks and controls and risks to technical and organizational measures. Now, famously in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, there's a line, first there was light. And I don't think the people that wrote that worked in security, because if you work in security, first there are risks. All of our customers, but likewise also cloud service providers, and likewise also regulators are aware of risks. Finma wants the documented risk management. That's actually what we're trying to achieve. Failures happen all of the time. That's something that our CEO, Werner Vogel, says. And so we put laws in place and regulations to ensure that these risks are not forgotten. And these come together and they build up a list of risks. So when I'm talking to a customer and a customer is asking me about a particular feature, I know actually what they're trying to do is mitigate a particular risk. And I know it probably comes from one of these two directions. The risk assessment direction is always very interesting because it can sometimes be based on what their own customers are doing, my customers' customers. Sometimes it's based on maybe a poor experience they had with another vendor. Sometimes it's based on actually regulation from a different country altogether, but they have it because it's a global organization. But these risks then are related to controls. And this is the relationship I think that's particularly important, to be able to distinguish between these two, especially when you're going in to have compliancy conversations, be it with the bosses or CISOs in your own organization, or with a regulator like Finma, or another regulator within another country, for example. And the relationship for me that I believe exists here is we are a technical organization here in Amazon Web Services. So I'm going to use a technical example. But if you take a service like Amazon S3, our simple storage service, we have essentially 70 plus APIs available to you as a customer to add, put, delete, list objects within a bucket. But our engineering organization can actually make changes under the hood, to use a certain phrase. They might make these changes related to performance. They might make these changes related to regulation. They might make these changes related to requirements that are coming in from customers. But our customers are abstracted from it. All they see is the API. Sometimes we need to add new APIs, but it's still all they see is the APIs. And this enables the engineering organization in Amazon Web Services to scale. And that is the relationship here between controls and risks. The controls enable us to scale, us being the cloud service provider, you to scale as the customer, and indeed the regulator to scale as well. So to give you an example, a customer might say to me, Margot, we have a risk, a concern. When we delete data, is it still accessible by yourselves in Amazon Web Services? And so we might then have controls like data is rendered unreadable. This is the control statement that we're tested against. Or it could be a different control, like devices are destroyed at the end of their life cycle. And these are the controls then that the regulators use to test these risks that we're trying to mitigate. And then we have a relationship, finally, with technical and organizational measures, which is a term we're all familiar with from GDPR. But it's the technical and organizational measures related to our services, our global infrastructure that Franz presented at the beginning, and our shared responsibility model that enable these controls to have no deviations found for the tests to be successful. So the list of risks that I was talking about earlier essentially defines our customers, your risk appetite. And typically when we're talking to customers, sometimes they're crystal clear on what their risk appetite is and they're not willing to move. Sometimes they're kind of clear on what their risk appetite is, but they're not exactly sure why. And they want to have more clarity from us on what's happening. And sometimes indeed their risk appetite might change. They might become more risk adverse or they might become less risk adverse. And this is all related to the scoping of services and locations. It's why Franz's introduction is very important and why I don't always just dive straight into the Finma stuff. Because related to the global infrastructure, the regions, the edge locations that you're using, and the types of services that you're using, your risk appetite may change and adjust. And so as the customer, you have the risk appetite. You come up and you define your risk appetite, but we help you when it comes to the scoping of services and locations. And you can reach out to your AWS account team for this kind of activity, or alternatively, you could reach out to Cockpit as well. So let's talk a little bit more about scoping of services and technical and organizational measures. The scoping of the services demonstrates the technical and organizational measures. So a key example would be, for example, the deployment of an Oracle database. You can deploy an Oracle database in many ways on AWS. One way would be using the AWS Relational Database Service. And in that scenario, we are managing the database for you. We're making it highly available. We're doing the disaster recovery for you. We're doing the security for you. We also automatically update the Oracle versions as Oracle makes new releases for you. But that gives us a certain Oracle admin role. It's required to do that. You might, through a scoping of services with us, define, no, we do not want AWS to have that particular role, and therefore decide to deploy the service natively on our EC2 instances, our virtual machines that Franz mentioned earlier, so that you, the customer, manages that Oracle admin role. And it's a very simple example of the scoping of services. But from that, you identify what it is you wish to manage. And then, of course, there are components that we are managing. But what's important is that there's a combined approach. If, for example, you need to demonstrate to a regulator that weak passwords are not being used and you have a certain type of strong password definition for your organization, this needs to be implemented both by AWS, and we are audited then by the likes of C5, PCI, SOC, the ISAE 3000 Type 2 report, which I've just mentioned, and the SOC reports. On your side, you're implementing this strong password, for example, using APIs, SDKs, and accessing it via the console. But together, there needs to be a unified approach, because if we're doing it and you're not, it's not going to meet the needs of the regulator. Likewise, if you've implemented strong passwords, but we haven't, then it's also not going to meet the needs of the regulator. And that's why this combined approach, the scoping of the services, the technical and organizational measures are important. So when you go about defining this combined approach and who is doing what and how you can demonstrate your side and how we can demonstrate our side, that is where these reports become particularly important. So these reports down on the left-hand side are accessed via AWS Artifact. If you type in Finma, at the moment you're going to see two entries there. I'm going to come to the other entry in a moment, but you'll see the ISAE report there. You'll see under reporting period, the time period that I spoke about earlier. And then you'll see a description of the report there. And so you can download the report from AWS Artifact. And when you open the report, the first section is a letter from AWS Security Insurance, signed by Chad Wolf, which is essentially stating our side of the shared responsibility model. The next part is a letter from the auditor, Ernst & Young, defining what it is that's in scope and what they are doing. Then we have services in scope and regions in scope, which I mentioned earlier. And then you come into chapter 3, which is the CUECs, some suggestions for CUECs. So CUECs are complementary user entity controls. These are essentially the controls. So remember what I touched on earlier on, the relationship between controls and risks. These are control statements that your workload has to align to on your side of the shared responsibility model to demonstrate sufficient evidence to Finma that it meets the security posture that Finma is looking for. Now, this section of the report is actually quite brief, in my humble opinion, but the reason for that is because this report is auditing us. It's auditing Amazon Web Services. It's not actually auditing you as the customer. So it's there as a suggestion. It says, for example, CUEC 7, you could use identity access management to monitor and access AWS services securely. Of course, there are many more ways in the AWS ecosystem that you can achieve this. And I'm going to talk about how you can harden and demonstrate your CUECs a little bit more later on. But just to highlight why this section is so brief, it's actually because the report is auditing Amazon Web Services. So then you come into section 4. And in this section, it has taken every single part of the circulars. It has printed out every single margin, sometimes it's called margin, sometimes requirement, sometimes control objective. So every single Finma control objective. And then, and here's an example here on this particular slide, I've purposely taken the one that I'm probably asked about the most, which is the possibility of restructuring or resolving the company in Switzerland must be assured, etc. And then it has a series of AWS controls mapped to the control statement. And so if you click one of these controls, you're brought to another part of the report. And in this part of the report, then, what you have is the control statement. So again, think back to that analogy I used. This is your API. So AWS provides the customer the ability to delete their content. Once successfully removed, the data is rendered unreadable. This control statement then is related to a series of Finma margins in this table. And then within the table, there are a series of tests, and this goes on for a couple of pages. And these are the tests that the Ernst & Young auditor registered in Zurich has carried out against AWS, against those 22 regions, 124 services in that time-bound period. And then in the report, they will always note deviations. And in this report, there are no deviations noted. As we go through report cycles, you'll see maybe more AWS controls appear. And indeed, for this ISAE report for Finma, we had to introduce 20 new controls. And this then will be updated on a yearly cycle going forward. So this very much tests the AWS control environment. But as I mentioned, you also have the customer side of the shared responsibility model that Finma looks for as well. And in the Finma language, they call it the CUECs, the customer user entity controls. And so if you go back to Artifact, you can download a second report. And this is a report that's generated by ourselves in AWS to help you with the CUECs. And we call this the Finma workbook. In the Finma workbook, at the moment, before I proceed, just to highlight, at the moment there, only one Finma workbook is there. The other 4 circular workbooks will be appearing over the next couple of months. They're not there yet. The content is written. It's going through legal approval at the moment in Amazon Web Services, and these things can take a while when it's going through legal, but they'll hopefully become available over the next couple of months. But the first one is there for 2018-03. And when you download this, what do you get? Essentially, you get a workbook where we take the regulatory requirement, and these workbooks actually exist also for other standards. So, for example, PCI or Singapore laws, Australian laws, there are many of these type of workbooks available to you in Artifact. And you take the Finma regulatory requirement. It is mapped to the AWS controls, just like the ISAE report. It's the exact same ones. So this is what you have from the ISAE report. But importantly here then on the right-hand side, it takes every single Finma control and maps it to AWS well-architected review statements. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the AWS well-architected process, but that's where a series of architectural review statements around pillars like reliability, security, operations, cost, and performance. And so all of the Finma control statements are taken and mapped against architectural best practices that are recommended from AWS. And in turn, then, these are mapped to, for example, AWS guard duty findings and AWS config rules. And so these are templates that you can use for your landing zone, your AWS environment, to harden that environment if it's applicable. And likewise, AWS conformance packs. And I'm going to show you an example of this further on. So when you download this workbook, you can view it in a couple of manners. One is a graph view. So here you see you have the Finma circular. Here are the chapters and then the sections. And then you might click on section. So let's go to the outsourcing to another country because it's really my most frequently asked question. And you see then there are two margins. And then you click on a margin. You see the AWS control objectives there. But then in green, you see the well-architected review statements that you can ensure that your workload is doing that you have enforced as part of your governance of your workload deployed on AWS. Likewise, you can actually view it in document format. So these are the chapter sections, and these are the sections then within the chapter for the 2013-03 auditing circular. And then when you click on one of these margins, you come into the control statement from Finma. So this is exactly margin 31 from the auditing circular. And then against that in blue, what you see are the well-architected review statements that apply to this particular control statement. Likewise, you will also see the AWS control activities that were tested by the auditor against this particular statement. If you then clicked in to one of these well-architected review pillars, so let's, for example, go into one of the security ones, there then you see a link to guard duty findings that you can download and implement in your AWS landing zone, or for example, AWS config rules. So a rule that will set a configuration snapshot for a particular service for you that you can demonstrate then to the regulator as part of your CUECs, because this is very much on the customer side of the shared responsibility model. Some of these might apply. Most of them probably wouldn't. It depends on the services that you're using, for example. So, for example, if you're not using SSM, for example, you don't necessarily need that AWS config rule for EC2 SSM. So, in summary, there are two sets of reports that you can use from Artifact to support your conversation with the regulator, with Finma, on the compliancy of your workload deployed on AWS. Remember, it's about controls. It's about customer user entity controls. So that's your side of the shared responsibility model. AWS controls, or sometimes we use the phrase AWS control environments. So those are a series of control statements that we are tested against. And then the Finma control objectives themselves listed in the circular. You access all of this content via Artifact, just like you would do C5 or SOC or PCI or any of the other circulars and attestations that you would use from AWS. The report is effective now, and it is effective in 22 regions now. This is not just when the Swiss region goes live. This is something that your organizations can start mobilizing on already. In terms of the services, there are 124 services in scope. Look at using services like AWS organizations to define organizational units and service control policies to ensure that only the services that are in scope of the report are being launched within your AWS environment. Likewise, as you saw from the Finma workbook, you can also deploy config rules, guard duty findings, and conformance packs as well to support your CUECs. There's a lot here. I have covered a lot in this section. It is not something that is necessarily terribly trivial. So please feel free to reach out to CopeBit with any questions, or indeed your AWS account team as well. And so that's a good leeway into maybe opening the floor for questions. Marco, if you want to take the floor back.
Yes, cool. Thank you so much, Margot, for the session. It was super interesting. Thanks a lot for giving that practical advice how to use these artifacts in AWS Artifact. It's really great to see how well you presented that. Thank you so much. So here we give you the opportunity to hand in questions. Yes, please type it into the chat window, and we read through them and try to answer them. So the first one is from Bruno. Margot, can you take that one, please?
Yeah, I see that there. So Bruno's asking, how can I access the Finma workbook? So the Finma workbooks and the ISAE Type 2 report, all of them are available via AWS Artifact, the same location for everything. Just type in Finma and you'll see the list of the Finma artifacts available to you. Just to cover what I said earlier, there's actually only one workbook mapping there at the moment. The reason for that is it's going through the final stages with the AWS legal, and hopefully the rest will be available very, very soon.
Thank you for that, Margot. And if anyone has issues finding it, reach out to us. You all will get an email from us so we can help you locate it. It's in AWS Artifact. That's actually a service inside of the AWS console. So you need to log in, so you won't find it with just Googling it. If you don't find it, reach out to us. We are glad to help you locating it. Cool. So there is another question from Nurdin. Looking at the Swiss market, how advanced do you see the cloud adoption compared to other countries? That's actually one that I give a first take on it, because I have been in Australia. You may have seen that in my introduction slide. So I do have a comparison here. So I was from 2015 up to 2018 in Australia, and in Australia it's really super hot with cloud adoption. So when I started to work in Australia for AWS partners, I went with the assumption that everyone is just starting and just looking at cloud, but the actual case was that big banks and lots of insurances already were all in. So even back in 2015, they really had very advanced architectures already built up in AWS. So I actually worked there with the second largest bank in Australia, and they moved within 18 months about 10,000 VMs in a lift and shift fashion to AWS. They educated several thousand people on AWS, and they're really advanced. And also the other big banks and smaller banks, super innovative, moving to any one of the three hyperscalers, or even going straight for a multi-cloud strategy. Which is super hard to implement. I would suggest go with AWS first, and you will be safe with your strategy. And maybe Margot, you work on a European level. Maybe you can add a few things here as well.
Yeah, my role is EMEA scope. So I also work with banks and across EMEA and South Africa. I will admit, Switzerland is not as far advanced as other countries. That's not a bad thing, though. I think, having worked in Switzerland now a while, I think Switzerland as a culture does things very well and has a perfectionist nature and quite accurate nature as part of their culture. And as part of that, approaches things a little bit more stealthily, maybe for the want of a better word. So it is interesting to see. I think it's quite exciting. And for me, what I really like about it is, because I have worked in other markets as well, I've worked in Ireland, I've worked in Italy and Sweden and America, it's actually very nice because often when I'm talking to Swiss customers about services, the services are in quite a mature state and have already been quite heavily tested by banks in other regions. So for me, the answer is not as far advanced as other countries, but that's part of the nature of doing things incredibly well here.
Cool. Thank you so much, Margot, for that. Good. Any other questions from the audience? So I don't see anyone typing. And I think we are pretty much in time. So thanks really everyone for spending the 45 minutes with us. It was a very interesting session. Thanks a lot for the large audience that has been here. You didn't see it, but it was quite a large audience for the webinar. So thank you so much for being here. If you need anything in the AWS space or container space, feel free to reach out. We are here and we gladly help you on the cloud journey. We really have worked with a number of financial institutions, and we certainly can help you as well. So thank you so much. Wish you a great evening and looking forward to the next webinar with all of you. Thanks, Margot, for your presentation. Thanks, Franz, for the introduction slides into AWS. Really appreciate your help here. And everyone, have a great week. Talk soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, Franz. Bye.
Bye.